Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In the last podcast, we dealt with the story in which David aligned with the Philistines by allying himself with Achish, king of Gath. That was in 1 Samuel 27. Of course, David pulled the wool over Achish's eyes by defeating Israelite enemies while telling Achish that he was defeating Israelites. That allowed David to ingratiate himself with Israel and simultaneously maintain a friendly relationship with his new Philistine ally. In today's podcast, we will continue that story as it is narrated in 1 Samuel 29. At the beginning of the previous chapter, the Philistines were preparing for war with Israel. That was in 1 Samuel 28, verse 1. Of course, Achish wanted David and his forces to fight on the Philistine side. If David did that, it would be enormously beneficial to Achish, both in political and military terms. Politically, were David to be seen fighting for the Philistines and against Israel, he would never be able to become an Israelite king. Militarily, David's forces would be a wonderful asset to the Philistine army. From Achish's perspective, this could not have been a better outcome. Of course, David had to keep the ruse going, so he readily agreed with Achish when Achish told him explicitly that the king expected David to go to battle with him against Israel. Achish even told David that he should become his lifelong personal bodyguard. That was in verse 2 of chapter 28. The Philistines deployed their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites deployed their forces in Jezreel as the battle was about to begin. That's the first verse of chapter 29. As David and his troops were marching in the rear of the formation along with Achish, several Philistine commanders noticed David. They could not believe their eyes. They blurted out incredulously, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" That's in verse 3. The use of the term Hebrew here is instructive. Hebrew is a specialized word. It is related to the Semitic term apiru and refers to people who, due to social, economic, or political circumstances, operate outside ordinary social frameworks. Keep in mind that is exactly how David and his men are described in 1 Samuel 22, verse 2. In that text, we learn that men who were in distress, in debt, or somehow disenfranchised had gathered to become part of David's group. David was a kind of ancient Robin Hood, living on the fringes of society, creating problems for those in charge, living off the land, and sometimes selling their services to the highest bidder. Very possibly, that is what the Philistine commanders meant when they referred to David and his men as Hebrews. Their primary loyalty was to themselves. Being leader of a Hebrew group was not the only thing that troubled the Philistine officers, however. They were also aware of David's connections to Israel. After all, he had been employed by Saul, Israel's current king. King Achish inferred that David's previous relationship with Saul was behind their question about the presence of the Hebrews in the pending battle. For that reason, Achish defended David. Indeed, he turned David's previous relationship with King Saul as part of his defense. After all, Achish pointed out, David had deserted Saul and had spent a considerable amount of time away from the Israelite king. Ever since that desertion, Achish had nothing but praise for David. According to Achish, David had maintained his loyalty to him, that is, the king of Gath. That's in verse 3 of chapter 29. Was that not an excellent reason for allowing David and his men to fight beside the Philistines? But the Philistine commanders were not convinced. In light of David's previous reputation as a competent and capable military man, and in light of his earlier relationship with Saul, the commanders simply could not believe that David's willingness to fight with the Philistines was credible. The commanders even remembered the ditty that Israelites sung after successful battles waged by both Saul and King David. That song was, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." How could the Philistine commanders trust a man that had earned this legendary reputation fighting in Israel's behalf? Indeed, what made Achish think that David might take the opportunity to turn against his new Philistine alliance? Because of the resounding veto of David's participation, Achish had no choice but to inform David that he could not, as a matter of fact, join his forces to the Philistine forces. That's in verses 4 through 7 of chapter 29. Achish indicated to David how disappointed he was about the commander's decision. He clearly did not agree with their assessment. David was being dismissed not because of any mistrust on Achish's part, but solely because of the hard-nosed position taken by the Philistine commanders. Achish tried to end the conversation by asking David to leave peaceably so that he not rile up the commanders. Of course, David protested this decision. He maintained that he had been loyal from the beginning. Since we know that, as a matter of fact, David had not attacked Israelites while he was allied with Achish, we also know that David is being deceptive. He is feigning loyalty. He had been attacking Israelite enemies while telling Achish that he had been attacking Israelites. David could not have been more duplicitous. When he protested the decision, he was being quite disingenuous. That's in verse 8 of chapter 29. Achish bought David's little charade. Once again, he insisted that, as far as he was concerned, David could not have been more devoted to him. Indeed, he referred to David as an angel of God. Despite his confidence in David's loyalty, nothing could change the commander's decision that David refrained from going into battle when the Philistines engaged Israel. That's in verse 9. Achish advised David to leave early the very next morning in verse 10. David did just as Achish had suggested. In the morning, he and his men got up early and went back to Philistine territory. In the meantime, the Philistines went to Jezreel, where the battle was about to take place. This episode, just like a couple of others in the David saga, seems bereft of any religious or theological content. The Israelite God is mentioned once, as well as an angel of God, but the speaker in that instance was Achish, the Philistine king of Gath. Philistines did not acknowledge the Israelite God. Most likely, Achish used this religious language to gain rapport with David. In any case, Achish invoked the Lord as a way of saying that he had not questioned David's loyalty. No other religious implications for Achish's statement seem evident. Taken at face value, it is not difficult to see the incident as favorable to David's long-term political ambitions. He had been anointed previously by the prophet Samuel to be Israel's king, a position he would assume later. Because of the Philistine commander's suspicions about David, he escaped the uncomfortable position that would have required him to take up arms against the very people over whom he was destined to become king. That was either a stroke of luck for David or a matter of providence. Given the nature of biblical narrative, it is more likely that we are to see this as a lurking providence. Somehow, God is influencing the situation so that David does not have to compromise himself. That may indeed be the case, but it has to be inferred. There is nothing more explicit about divine activity in the text. For now, however, we witness circumstances unfolding that will make it possible in the future for David to become Israel's king. It was a close call by all counts. Nevertheless, David's reputation would not be sullied by his having to wield the sword against Israelites. His ruse of siding with the Philistines remains hidden, just as God doubtlessly wanted it. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. If you have a question you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, go to the email fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.